Hi everyone and welcome. We're down here in my wormery and I've got a few things here on my checklist that need attention. So I thought I'd bring the camera along, have you guys keep me company. So let me really quickly go through what I've got going on here. Number 61 is the bin up here in the upper left hand corner. That one is what I'm referring to as a finishing tub. It has what I consider to be finished castings in it. And 11 days ago was the last time we tried unloading baby hatchling worms. Because I guess that's the one thing that you get when you've got a tub full of castings, is that you have to assume that all the worms have been removed, but all of their eggs are still there and primed for hatching soon. So those worm eggs, those worm cocoons are really what we're after there. And it's not so much the cocoons, but it's the hatchlings that come out of them. So after 61 days, I would have to guess that any cocoons that may have made their way into that tub have since hatched. Hopefully the little worms have had time to grow a little bit and become mobile enough to hopefully find their way down to that baiting box that I've got in there. It's a box that has some holes on the side of it, delicious foods placed inside, and really it's the only game in town. No other food in the bin other than that. So the idea is that we're trying to lure worms out of that finished compost to the point where we can clearly see throughout that compost that it's been depopulated. So that's really what we're after here. And we've been giving it as much time as necessary, since who knows, you know, some of the worms could be so minute and they could be in the far reaches of the bin, it could take time. And we're really not in a rush, so we've been driving towards completion of that bin with multiple removals of baited worms, typically going into what had been my newest worm bin, which is the white one, but it's not my newest anymore. Right next to it is really my newest bin, which is also on the list. It's the one down here on the bottom, which is now 14 days old. And it's not been fed formally yet, so today I've got some food for it. Got some melon rinds here and whatnot, banana peels. Straight out of the freezer, you can see frost developing on it. It's thawing here, so we're going to feed with this stuff over here. And obviously adding worms. And that's not only the worms that are coming out of the finishing tub, but the third to-do item here on this 91-day-old bin, which is the one that's in the lower right-hand corner, and that's the one that's getting dripped all over, all those moisture stains. So the bin right above it has holes, and there's been a lot of moisture coming out of that one dripping down. So I'm gonna have to put something under there while we're working on that bin. So that bin is undergoing what I refer to as a horizontal migration. I've pretty much put a stop to feedings in that tub, and well, I am feeding, but not feeding for the purposes of vermicomposting per se. I'm feeding for the purposes of trying to lure the worms. Again, similar to what's going on in this one. Try to lure the worms out of the material, but here it's really trying to lure the entire working population out of the tub to result in finished castings, which may still be riddled with cocoons. In the case of this one, it's really just responding to the hatchlings, the new worms that are emerging over time. So that's kind of what we're after here. In both cases of luring the worms out, whether it's the horizontal migration that's going on here or just the baiting of the worms going on here, we will, depending on what we see there, decide on what's next. You know, we'll probably end up just reloading the bait in both cases and letting the process continue. That's assuming that we see worms in the material still requiring that sort of attention. So let me go put a glove on and we'll get started. Alright, so now the finishing tub, the setup we're seeing here is covered in plastic. The plastic is attempting to promote the recirculation of moisture. Any moisture that would normally just want to evaporate into the air is kept down within the bin right under the plastic to make sort of a more damp, hospitable place, worm friendly, to further attract the worms. So not only food being used to try to attract the worms here, but also moisture. Here's a worm trying to explore a little bit. Let's make sure he stays in the box, right? So first thing I'll normally do here is just set this thing aside and see if there's any worms right there on the perimeter, because there's holes on these two sides, and these are the two sides where they're coming and going. This is where we might expect to see some worms that were kind of on the verge of making their way into the container, but we're not quite in there yet. Sensing that there's something interesting going on there and trying to make their way over, but not quite making it there. Nice and damp. And the plastic that was covering is the main reason for that, I believe. If it were not for that, this material would be drying out a lot more. So like here on the other side where there was no plastic covering it, you can feel right away the material is way different. It's a lot drier across the top, and even as you work your way down through the material, you can feel it. It's a little cooler, it's a little bit more damp, but definitely not as moist as what was under the plastic. With the humid days of summer rolling in, I've been gradually removing these plastic covers from all my bins to try to promote the drying out of the material in the bins, and we might just do the same here. You can see once in a while we encounter a pretty good sized mature worm here and there. We've got a couple of them, and these are not worms that were born recently. They're just worms that kind of slid by and were not part of the migration and extraction of worms when we originally harvested this batch of castings. They kind of snuck in, remained in the castings, and they were kind of enjoying this space for a while all to themselves until all the little baby worms started hatching. So other than those one or two large worms we see here and there, it's clear that the majority of what we're seeing in this material is pretty small size little worms cruising around, and they are all over the place. I mean, they are everywhere. So I would have to say that this bin is far from being depopulated. But we probably should take a look inside our little bait box to see how many worms we did manage to round up. Whether or not I'm going to continue using this as the method for trying to depopulate this material, or if I'm going to switch gears on that, is kind of up in the air right now, because I'm not usually very impressed with the results that I get from using these boxes. I usually feel like we could have done a lot better, a lot more quickly, and I'm actually thinking of setting this one up kind of like the other bin that we're going to be working on. That one's set up with what I refer to as a horizontal migration, where the entire edge of the bin is set up with a fresh load of bedding, fresh food, everything like that. A nice fresh environment for the worms to make their way into, allowing this material to just sit out in the open air, dry out, and become less and less hospitable for the inhabitants, resulting in them being encouraged to go find a better place to be. Let me get a stick that we could use to probe into here to remove the last bit of this. This part I always try to do very gingerly. I don't want to be squashing or severing any worms in the process of doing this. I'm just trying to dislodge all of this bedding that was thrown in here so that it more easily pops out. It does seem like it has a fair number of worms hanging out in it. Let's see what we got in here. Still a few hanging out down in the box. So you can tell we're not hauling out large numbers of worms by doing it this way. So it's just kind of an interesting thing, you know, hey, I've got this box that's got holes in it, let's give it a try, why not? But I do feel like kind of a better system's going to be needed here, because this material just seems like it's got way more little baby worms in it than I was expecting, you know, frankly speaking. I did not think that we're going to see so many hatchlings coming out of the material, but we do, and there's just tons of them, you know. I think giving this whole bin sort of a little stir, getting all this more damp stuff off the bottom, allow it to get up to the top so that it can air out a little bit, and get some of the more dry stuff that's been out on the top surface for a few weeks now down low, so that it can help absorb moisture as well. That'll all help bring closure to this bin sooner rather than later, I think. We've nicely kind of stirred up the material on this edge. So I guess if we just keep on going across, we could try to do so with the intent of leaving a void on this end over here, so that we could reset this edge and turn that into the edge that we're going to try to lure the worms into. But after we get done stirring things up here, there's going to be there's really not going to be much of a concentration of moisture in any one place anymore. It will have been spread around pretty evenly once we get through with this. I'm going to try to keep my eye on the finish line here and keep us moving so I don't goof off like I always do. What we need to do is pretty straightforward. Just need to give ourselves a space over here into which we can rest some fresh bedding, throw in a fresh supply of food, and then maybe even use that plastic to promote the recirculation of any moisture that would otherwise evaporate, and as a result create a really cozy spot that the worms will want to go to for sure, taking into account that the material that they occupy right now is basically their poop. And it is, you know, fairly well broken down, so there's not a great deal of remaining food left in it, and, you know, virtually no bedding as far as I can tell. So let's go ahead and build this side up here as a nice cozy place for the worms to come. And to be honest, I've been thinking that it was time to do this a while ago already. Every time I get back into trying to use my little bait bombs and trying to use little alternate devices to get the worms to go from point A to point B, it always seems like the most simple, straightforward approach works best, and that's what we're doing here, which is referred to by some as horizontal migration, and that is a pretty descriptive name. You know, it makes complete sense. Horizontally through the bin, the worms are intended to migrate over into the new space that we want them to occupy. I'm going to backfill a little bit of this here to give us a little bit more of a defined area for this feeding zone to be. I don't want it to be too large. I'd like to limit its size to about what we're doing here. Here, let's use this thing. This way I can kind of build up the wall there a little bit more confidently without worrying too much about having everything spill down into my work in progress over here, the feeding zone. Oh, looks like I've got one more worm to get out of here. Little guy. They're hard to spot. Alright, that worked pretty good. Just a little simple something to help us there to kind of build up this nice defined space, or better defined space, for this to be in. So just want to make sure I've done a good job airing all of this stuff out, and I think I did. I think I covered pretty much the entire bin with a good little jostle. Let's get back to finishing off this feeding zone over here. The food we're giving them is beginning to melt nicely. It's thawing out, sitting out here at room temperature. Hesitated there for a moment, questioning whether I was going a little bit overboard with the quantity of food that we've got in here, but I mean, you saw it. The numbers of worms in here is pretty high. I think we're safe. I think we've got plenty of worms in this bin to handle the job of breaking this stuff down. Now these, well, this piece of cardboard that had been covering up the bait box will be a good cover for this food. Try to keep the scent of it down and avoid attracting flying insects. I think the coffee also does a great job at that too, so that's another good reason to cover up the feedings with a little bit of coffee. Once that coffee goes on, it's almost indistinguishable from the castings themselves. So I'm going to, I guess I'll just rest these pieces of used cardboard over the top too. It'll help us more easily pin down where this feeding zone was next time we come in here, otherwise it could be difficult to see. Although, no, we're going to have another telltale to let us know where that was, and that's going to be the plastic. So the plastic's going to come back, serving the new purpose of maintaining hydration over on this edge. I'm going to try to focus it a little bit here. I'd prefer for the rest of the material to begin airing out and drying out so that it can be more easily harvested later, and also to make it a little bit less hospitable for the worms. You know, not uncomfortable per se, but as it dries out, they're going to keep looking for a more damp place to be, and over where we're feeding is where they'll find that. So I'm glad that we took care of that. I've been wanting to do this for some time now. I've just been dawdling. I think to further help drying out over on this edge, I believe I'm going to replace what had been on top, which is that fairly thick piece of cardboard, with just a thin sheet of paper. So I took some of this packing paper, I think is what it is. It's just the kind of paper you find in a parcel. It's been crinkled up to protect the parcel. It's almost like a paper bag, but a little bit thinner, I would say. So you can see I've not taken great care to make it go all the way out to the edge. That's fine. I'd like for this to air out and really kind of get to the finish line soon if possible. So hopefully this measure that we took today will help with that. So let's keep our fingers crossed and keep tracking this one. It's been 61 days now, and who knows? It's always kind of a wild card. You never know how long it's going to take for all the worms to emerge from all of the cocoons and all make their way over to where you want them to be. So it's just kind of interesting to observe, you know. So if at some point we really get sick of waiting, who knows? Throw the stuff right out in the garden, worms and all. That's always an option too. All right, so let's get on to the other bin that we've got to get the worms out of. All right, so I left behind the cardboard that had been covering this thing up, so that all that dripping that's coming down onto here can go onto that cardboard rather than onto the floor. And it's a good thing that this was there to cover the bin. Otherwise, all that moisture would have simply dripped right down into here and made this bin into a big sopping wet mess. So you can see here too, I'm not covering up with plastic other than over in the feeding zone. This is kind of similar to what we set up on the finishing tub to try to lure worms out of the material. This is doing the same exact thing, except in the case of this, we're not luring future baby worms that are yet to be hatched. Here we've got a full population of composting worms doing their thing. And since we've kind of decided that the bin is more or less ready for it and that the material that they've converted is pretty much done, it is time to move them out of it so we can harvest all those castings. The worms that we've been trying to round up should be right in here in this migration zone. So luckily we've still got a little bit of room in here. We can hopefully fit all these hulled worms into this tray. Let's see, before we do that though, I'm going to collect a lot of this sort of drier, uncomposted, large chunk stuff off the top surface, just to see if what's right below it is in fact finished castings and nothing but. It does seem that way. It does seem like a lot of this large stuff is really just on the surface. Sometimes I like to try to gather that larger stuff up off the surface and get it back down to where the feedings are going to be going on, because it's technically not finished compost, right? It's stuff that still requires a little bit of work to get to that point. So we'll use this when we rebuild this feeding zone. And over here, it does seem like if it's possible to preserve some of these finished castings that are resting right on top of the feeding zone, then that would probably be a good idea too. Why haul out a bunch of finished castings with the worms if you don't have to? But there does come a point where you do need to recognize that you're going to be hauling these worms out kind of wholesale, along with whatever material they're occupying. So let's see if we can sort of distinguish between where the finished castings are and where our feeding zone is. Sometimes I'll build a little cardboard barrier between the finished compost and the feeding zone to make it clearer for me and easier to see where the cutoff is. But this is just as good. It's certainly not scientific. Now the question is, do we somehow fit all these in here? I hope so. I guess the big question is also, how many did we round up? I'm curious about that too. So we're going to start hauling them out, piling them up. All right, let's continue with this extraction here. You could tell when you're holding it that it's occupied by tons of worms because the whole thing squirms in your hand. It's kind of cool. What do we got left here? 2 more handfuls maybe? Still see some of what was put in here to try to lure them over. Coffee, some of the paper that was used to wrap up the food that was given to them. I'm not sure if this is going to be the last handful. We might have to do one last sweep. I think we did pretty good here. Definitely curious to see how many worms we've succeeded in gathering here. This harsh bright light is going to cause these little guys to dive pretty soon. So now's the time to check them out before they all vanish out of view. I think we got a pretty good haul there. It's got some nice weight to it. I know a lot of it's going to be uneaten food and bedding material and whatnot, but hopefully a good percentage of it is worms. I'm going to set this aside so we can get this all reset and back into service. All that remains now is really to just get things covered up the way we found it, and that consists of getting this plastic bag back over where we want moisture to continue recirculating, which is right over where the food is. As for the rest of the bin, we're going to cover up with nothing more than this piece of paper, and we're going to skip putting the cardboard back on that was on here before. Besides, that stuff is totally soaked from having the bin above it drip all over it. Oh yeah, I almost forgot. And I kind of forgot to do this in another bin before too the other day, which is to, to get a sense of how good our migration is progressing. So we're just going to take a quick peek down into this material. Not only are we trying to sense if we've got a lot more worms that need to exit the castings, it also gives us a little bit of a chance to pull up more damp material from the lower reaches of the bin to get that up onto the surface, give it a chance to air out a bit, and then take some of the more dry stuff and mix it into the more damp stuff to try to equalize the moisture levels. Because the stuff out here on the top is nice and crumbly and dry. Once the stuff from below combines with it, we'll have a really nice consistency castings here. Out here on the far reaches, I'm not seeing quite as many worms, which is really what we're after. And I think by agitating stuff and getting the more damp stuff combined with more dry stuff, we are ultimately resulting in a bin that has somewhat less cozy accommodations for the worms. The material is really nice. Plenty of worms down here through the middle, but yeah, out here on the further edge, it seems like we're definitely getting good results on the migration. But there's also clearly enough of a population remaining in this material that we can see that it does make sense to continue it, to try to really get this material evacuated. Really nice stuff. So I'm glad to be getting this more damp material up off the bottom of the bin. Let it air out a little bit. Oops. Let it combine with the more dry stuff that we had on the top surface. Okay, so for 91 days, seems like we're making some pretty decent progress here. I think it was what? It was 7 days since we last checked in. So if we check in here another 7 days from now, that'll get us pretty close to 100 days of age. So who knows? Somewhere in the next 7 to 10 days we might pop in here. Maybe we'll wait until it's 100th day birthday and see how much closer we are to the finish line, depopulating these castings so we can harvest. Continue towards the finish line. So now something I did off camera here, spent a little bit of time on our collection of the feeding zone and tried to take the baited worms and the collected worms, migrated worms that were in here, and I did my best to try to separate them here. So I've got a little tray, the lid of this container actually, with sort of a separated worm slash feeding zone contents where it's not a clean separation. I would have to say that there's still probably quite a bit of worms in here, but this is the best I could do in trying to separate the worms from the compost that they were inhabiting, and they must not like this at all. They've got nowhere to dive down into and hide from these bright lights, so I don't want to prolong this. All I want to do is give this a quick weigh, and then I want to throw in a little bit of math here to say that, hey, since we were unable to get all the worms out of here, can we estimate how many of the worms remained in this material? And I would have to say that just looking at the amount and guessing, I would have to say whatever this amounts to be, we would probably want to add somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 of this weight to that amount to account for all the worms that are in here. And when it comes time to releasing them, since this is mainly the material that came out of the feeding zone, probably rich in castings but also still rich in bedding and food, we're going to include this with the worms as part of their feeding, in addition to the first feeding that this bin is going to be receiving, which is these leftovers here. So between all of this and this, it's a pretty generous feeding, and this bin is going to probably need it because it's 14 days since it was launched, and there was food included in the original build of that bin, but none's been added during that time, other than like what we're doing here, is other than some of the residual food that came over with the worms that were being migrated. So really quick, before we move on to that step of releasing these worms and feeding the newest of my bins, let's get the scale out here. Let's get the scale out here, and the first thing we could do is we can zero it. And I don't know what the weight of this lid is, but since it's the same type of lid as the worms are on, we can zero it to account for the weight of the lid. And then once we put this on here, it'll deduct the weight of the lid to tell us precisely how many worms, or at least in weight, how many worms we've got on the tray. And it looks like we've got ourselves 6 ounces of worms in here, right? So if our estimate of how many worms remain in the rest of the material is correct, that 1/4 of what we see here accounts for all the worms that are in here, then we'll throw that 1/4 onto here as well. That'll take us to 7.5 ounces. We'll just round that to 8 ounces. If we call this an 8 ounce extraction of worms, that's 1/2 pound. In most people's estimation, that amounts to approximately 500 worms. And that's really what I was after, was some sort of a rough guess as to how many worms we're talking about here. So it's pretty cool. Let's get these guys situated in their new home. Let's get this out of the way. And in comes the newest of our bins. So this thing's now 14 days old. At this point, I believe it's probably the last of my bins, or close to being the last of my bins, that still use plastic to cover up the material. And that's because I want most of my other bins to start getting a little bit drier, whereas this bin being brand new, I don't think it's a problem. So I'm not going to worry too much about removing this plastic covering for now. I'm going to allow for this bin to retain as much of the moisture that it has in it now as possible, trying to lose as little as possible to evaporation. And then later on in its life cycle, when it gets closer to being kind of a mature bundle of worm castings, we'll attempt to help it dry out a little bit. So now each time I've ever been in this bin, it's always just been to throw stuff on top, release worms basically. I've not yet been in here to feed. So this will be our first chance to sort of poke down into the material to see how things are progressing after 2 weeks. Very young bin, but also pretty heavily populated bin. This bin would not have had its feeding placed into any one particular spot. So I think that opening up the material to see what's below is probably going to be representative throughout of what we're seeing here. Although, you know, maybe I'm not being 100% correct, because some of the food that came over with the worms as we launched them, just like we're going to have happen today with all of this remaining food scraps that came over with the worms, would have been in the middle. So maybe there'd be more interest in the middle because of the food that came with the launched worms every time we released worms into here. So just to see, let's take a look over here on the edge. Very shallow, very little material in here. Moisture level seems pretty good, and that's usually unusual in my bins, especially out in the far corners and especially when the bin is still this young. But the plastic covering really is what helps preserve the moisture within the bin and keep it nice and cozy throughout. So that means even out here on the far reaches of the bin, where it would normally be kind of dry and harsh, from a worm's point of view, it's actually quite cozy and nice. Cool and damp and kind of nice, like I said. So like to see what I'm seeing here. I like the quality of the castings. Everywhere I reach down, I can feel it's just a whole bunch of castings everywhere. I think I saw a banana stem somewhere, which usually does take worms a few weeks to break down completely. And some larger chunks of bedding, pieces of cardboard here and there. But I doubt that we're going to find many, if any, other larger chunks of food in here, other than that banana stem. So that's pretty cool. Just in the nick of time, I would say. Even though there would have been food added along the way with the launch of worms, kind of in this form, I do feel better knowing that we're getting around to finally feeding this bin with some fresh food. So I'm going to start off just with a little sprinkling of bedding. I think bedding is going to be the main theme today on this bin, because I do want to make sure there's adequate bedding in this thing, piled up high on top when we get done. So I might end up emptying half that box into here just to make sure we've got a good ample supply of bedding on top. Right into here, I believe we can go ahead and drop in all of the material that came along with the worms. This is probably fairly rich in food. Obviously it's rich in castings too, I think you could tell just from the look of it. But the worms definitely didn't break down and consume all of the food that was in that feeding zone. I think a lot of this mush is in fact kind of partially broken down, kind of gooey food stuff that's no longer really recognizable as what it was, unless it's sort of a larger piece of a mango skin or whatever that was. Most of the stuff is going to be unrecognizable from what it used to be, but I believe it is still mainly food. So this is going to make for a nice appetizing feast for these little guys. All this partially broken down food. I'm sure the worms are going to come swarming in for that soon, once we let them get back to work. But before we can do that, we've just got to get this feeding in here. There's really not that much, but I knew we were going to be bringing a bunch of uneaten food over as part of the migration of the worms that were coming over. So I'm not feeling like I'm being too skimpy. I think this is a pretty good kind of a complement to all that other kind of unrecognizable food that they're getting. I want to get this covered up a little bit with some leaves. Sprinkle a few leaves here and there. I want to forget including a little bit of a, let's throw in a little bit of grit too. Can't hurt. And then we'll try to get things covered up here nicely. This is going to be a nice cozy setup for these little guys. I've got a few pieces of paper here. Every time I was fashioning a new piece of paper to cover up one of my bins to replace the plastic and everything else that was there, I kept these little end pieces, little scraps. Let's use this as the platform to drop our worms onto. I did it this way last time, and by having a little bit of a barrier there, it prevented the worms from going straight down into the material, and it kind of extended the time we get to check them out as they get released into their new space. So, here we go. The remainder of the worms getting set free into their new space. Okay, we got them all. They probably don't appreciate the dry material that they've been placed on, so hopefully they'll squirm out of view looking for a more hospitable place to be, a place that's not in the bright lights. All right, let's give these guys a little time to get acclimated to the new space, and then we'll check back in with them in a few minutes. Well, that must have been a pretty trying ordeal for these little guys. I feel bad for them. I think we're done here. I'm going to just use these pieces of paper that were thrown in here as kind of landing pads, places for the moisture that's going to be collecting on the plastic over them, place for the moisture to land on, let the worms hang out on, basically bedding, which is also the purpose of this top coating of leaves that I'm throwing on here. I think with the moisture kicking off of the food that they've just received, recirculating because of the plastic coating on this cover, I think we're going to have a pretty nice cozy spot for these little guys. So if I'm not mistaken, we started with what was estimated to be about 2,900 worms in here, and we just added something in the neighborhood of 500, which would amount to about 3,400. So, you know, a little bit of wiggle room in there. You could even go as far as thinking that there might be as many as 3,500 worms in this bin, which really ain't bad. Probably means that it's going to be a hungry bin and is going to need to be fed often. So, and you know what? It's not even the last of it. We're going to be putting more worms in here over time. So this population will definitely grow. So this is going to become a bin to watch, that's for sure. All right, everyone, that's it for today. All I've got is a little putting away here. I've already done most of my cleanup while those worms were squirming out of sight. But I won't bother you with that. That's boring. I'll just take this as a chance to say thank you. Thank you for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, then as always, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's really appreciated. Also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye.